They say an empress is born with jewels in her cradle. I was not. I was born in a shack that smelled of sweat and wine. My father a bear trainer for the hippodrome. My mother a dancer who sold her beauty to hungry crowds. When he died, leaving us nothing but debts, my mother dragged me and my sisters into the theatre to survive. That was my cradle, the arena of jeers, lust, and coins tossed at our feet. You cannot understand Byzantium without understanding the theatre. It was no mere stage for plays. It was an underworld, a marketplace of bodies and appetites. I was a child, but already the crowds demanded more than laughter. They demanded shame. They demanded skin. They demanded that young girls learn early how to sell themselves to feed their families. I learned to paint my face in colors that made me older, to move my hips in ways that made the men cheer, to speak with a sharp tongue that made them laugh while their hands reached for me. The chronicles written later by men, those smug historians who called themselves guardians of truth, claimed I performed acts too obscene to be repeated. They said I displayed myself in the theatre with geese, with grapes, with anything that would make a crowd gasp. They said I was shameless, that I was filth. Perhaps some of it is true, perhaps some of it is invention. But ask yourself, what choice did a girl have when her mother's hands were trembling, when the bread on the table was gone, when men who sat in silk togas decided whether you would eat or starve? Theodora, that was my name, but in those years, it was not a name. It was a curse spat by matrons, a jest whispered by senators, a commodity shouted by drunkards in the taverns. I was the girl who learned to use her body as armor, her tongue as a dagger. Men wanted me humiliated, and I learned to humiliate them in return, with wit sharper than their lust. I was not yet an empress, but already I was dangerous, because I understood the secret that ruled Byzantium. Shame is a chain only if you let others lock it. If you take hold of it yourself, it becomes a weapon. The streets of Constantinople reeked of incense and sweat, of fish from the harbors, and the stink of unwashed crowds pressed against the walls of Hagia Sophia. I wandered those streets with coins sewn into my garments, always alert for thieves, always alert for men who thought a girl alone could be taken without consequence. I watched the processions of senators and generals, the priests chanting as if holiness lived in their throats. I laughed bitterly even then, for I saw their eyes glance sideways toward the brothels, their hands brushed along against slave girls carrying water. Piety was their mask, lust was their truth. I, who had no mask, was called a sinner. Do you think I resented it? I did, but I also studied it. I studied men as another might study scripture. I learned what they craved, what they feared, how they revealed themselves when drunk, how they trembled when confronted by a clever tongue. I knew how to make them cheer for me in the theatre, and I knew how to make them pay for the privilege. By the time I was 15, I was no longer just a performer. I was a courtesan in all but name, invited to private banquets where men who thundered against vice in the Senate begged for the very things they condemned. Those nights taught me something more horrifying than the theatre ever had, that Byzantium was ruled not by laws, nor by emperors, nor by priests, but by appetites. Appetites for power, for flesh, for humiliation. Men who could conquer provinces could not conquer themselves. And the women who learned how to feed, or starve, those appetites could wield power greater than any sword. I became infamous, yes. I was whispered about, mocked in public, cursed by matrons who told their daughters not to look at me. But the same men who spat at me in daylight sent messengers to my door by night. I wore silks paid for by their hypocrisy. I ate feasts bought with their shame. And I learned to smile through it all, even as my heart grew cold. For deep inside, I knew I did not belong to them. I was waiting for the day when I would no longer be the one performing at their tables, but the one who decided who sat at mine. That day seemed impossibly far. I was a girl of low birth, marked by scandal, with no father to claim honor for me. But Byzantium is a city of masks, and masks can be worn by anyone bold enough to seize them, I watched women in the palace, empresses draped in gold, eunuchs who ruled through whispers, slaves who rose to the favor of generals. And I realized something: power was not inherited, it was taken. And I had already learned how to take what others thought I did not deserve. Do you want me to confess my shame? Then hear it from my own lips. Yes, I lived by the theatre, by the taverns, by the lust of men. I did what I had to do, but that was not the end of me. It was the forge that tempered me. Fire and humiliation burned away the softness of youth, leaving behind steel. Steel that would one day sit on a throne. They called me shameless. They were right. For shame is the chain of the weak. And I had sworn I would never be weak again. If the palace was Byzantium's mask of piety, the theatre was its exposed flesh, and it was in that flesh that I was shaped. To the noble matrons who whispered my name with disgust, the hippodrome and its theatres were cesspools of vice, places where shame flourished. They were right, and yet it was there that I learned truths about my empire that no court tutor ever could. The theatre was not simply a stage. It was a battlefield where lust, laughter, and humiliation were traded like coins. The actors performed comedies filled with crude jests, satires mocking the powerful, mimes that pushed the boundaries of obscenity. And I, a girl still on the edge of womanhood, was thrust into this world to survive. The chroniclers who later wrote of me did so with venom. They said I performed acts too vile to describe, that I was little more than an animal paraded for men's amusement. They said I disrobed without shame, that I played roles meant to arouse more than entertain, that I bent my body into positions that made the crowd roar with both laughter and desire. They told the story of how I lay on the stage, while geese pecked at barley scattered upon my body, turning me into a spectacle that delighted the mob. Was it true? Perhaps. Was it exaggerated? Certainly. But understand this: those men who wrote such things were not neutral historians. They were senators, priests, rivals, men who despised me not because of what I had done in the theatre, but because I later rose above it. They wanted history to remember me as filth, so that my power could be dismissed as a horse trick rather than a woman's triumph. Yet I will not deny the theatre's horrors. I remember nights when the crowd's laughter turned to jeers, when drunken men shouted for more, when I could feel their eyes crawling over my skin, as though I were meat hung in the marketplace. I remember the stench of wine on their breath, the coins tossed at my feet, the bruises left by hands that gripped too tightly backstage. It was survival, not art. It was hunger wrapped in performance. And it left scars far deeper than the eye could see. But the theatre was also education. I learned the power of spectacle. I learned that a body displayed can humiliate or enthrall, that a clever jest can cut more deeply than a blade. I learned that men who mocked me on stage could later be made to beg in private. The very acts they condemned, they also desired, and I understood that contradiction better than any philosopher. Do you want to know what Byzantium's most horrifying practices were? It was not only the spectacles of flesh, but the hypocrisy that cloaked them. Senators sat in the hippodrome by day, condemning the corruption of performers, and then sought out those same performers by night in the taverns. Priests thundered sermons about chastity, while sending secret coins to courtesans. The same men who mocked my shame built their lives upon it. I was told I should have been crushed by such a life, that I should have remained a forgotten girl whose name was lost among the countless others. But I turned vice into a weapon. If men would reduce me to spectacle, then I would master spectacle. If they would jeer, then I would make their jeers part of my act, wielding mockery against them until even they laughed at themselves. If they would see me as shameless, then I would be shameless, and I would make shame itself bow to me. There were darker practices still. You must understand that in Byzantium, the line between entertainment and exploitation was as thin as silk. Girls younger than I were forced onto stages. Boys were trained as dancers, their beauty admired more than their skill. Slaves were ordered to perform degrading acts before crowds that cheered as though cruelty were comedy. These were not whispered vices, they were public, applauded, expected. And yet, when I was accused of participating, they acted as though I had invented such things myself, as though the entire empire were not built on the same corruption. The taverns were worse. There, without the mask of performance, the lust was raw, unrestrained. I remember the heat of crowded rooms, the press of bodies, the shouts of men gambling with dice even as they pulled at the skirts of serving girls. I remember seeing nobles disguised in plain cloaks, seeking indulgence away from the eyes of their peers. I saw things that would make any priest clutch his cross tighter, and I stored them in memory, knowing one day those secrets could be used as weapons. Yes, I lived in the mire. Yes, I was stained by it. But do not mistake me for a victim. Every night I survived was a night of training. Every jeer I endured became armor. Every humiliation taught me to wield humiliation myself. And in time, the very city that spat on me would kneel before me, calling me Empress. But I do not forget those days. I cannot. When I walked into Hagia Sophia later as wife of Justinian, robed in gold, crowned in jewels, I remembered how once I had walked barefoot across its steps, mocked and ignored. When the priests bowed before me, I remembered how once they had sneered at me. When senators knelt for my favor, I remembered how their whispers had branded me harlot. And I smiled, not with joy, but with vengeance. So let history say what it will. Let them repeat their tales of geese and grapes, of obscene acts in the theatre. Let them laugh at the shame of my youth, for I know the truth they dare not speak, that it was not the theatre that corrupted Byzantium. It was Byzantium that created the theatre, and if I was forged in its fires, it was only because the empire itself was already ablaze with vice. I was not the most horrifying practice of Byzantium, I was its mirror, and the men who despised me most were the ones who could not bear to see their reflection in me. Every empire has its hidden ladders. Some are built of blood, some of coin, and some of flesh. Mine was built of all three. From the filth of the taverns and the humiliation of the theatre, I climbed toward the palace, each rung a scandal, each step a betrayal. And I climbed without hesitation, because I had already learned the first truth of Byzantium. Only those who rise above shame survive. I was still young when I caught the eye of men whose names carried weight beyond the hippodrome. At first, it was senators seeking novelty, generals chasing distraction, merchants with purses heavy from trade. They wanted me for a night, but I wanted more than their lust. I wanted their secrets, their weaknesses, the promises they whispered when drunk and vulnerable. I learned to listen as much as I pleased. A careless word from their lips became a weapon in my hands. I was a courtesan, yes, but I was also a collector of debts, a chronicler of weaknesses. My reputation grew. They mocked me in public, but sought me in private. That was Byzantium's way, and when one lover was finished, another arrived, each offering more than the last. Some gave me jewels, others gave me houses, and some gave me names of enemies I would one day use against them. Slowly, I wove myself into the very fabric of the city. I was no longer merely a performer. I was a shadow in the courts, unseen but ever present, feared as much as desired. But desire alone cannot build an empire. It was wit that lifted me higher. I discovered early that beauty fades quickly in the eyes of men, but a sharp tongue and clever mind endure. At banquets, I cut rivals with words as others did with blades. I mocked the hypocrisy of priests to their faces, daring them to condemn me, even as they trembled with guilt for what I knew of their private lives. I could make a hall of drunken men roar with laughter, then silence them with a glance. Men began to realize I was not just flesh, I was fire. Still, fire alone could not breach the palace walls. I needed a ladder that reached further than any lover's bed. I found it in Hesebolas, a provincial governor who took me to Libya as his mistress. For a time, I thought I had secured comfort, perhaps even safety. But like all men who believe themselves powerful, he tired of me. He cast me aside as though I were nothing more than a garment worn too often. I was humiliated, stranded, betrayed, but betrayal is not an ending, it is a lesson. and I swore never again to be dependent on the whims of any man. It was on the long road back to Constantinople that I found something unexpected, God, or perhaps I should say, I found the mask of God. In Alexandria, I encountered followers of a sect who preached of redemption, of women as equal to men in the eyes of heaven. They spoke of forgiveness, of strength, of dignity beyond the theatre's shame. I listened, I learned, I prayed, and whether it was faith or cunning, I emerged changed. To some, I was reborn. To others, I was simply more dangerous, for now I could wrap my scandalous past in the cloak of piety. I had discovered the greatest trick of all, that Byzantium revered sinners only once they claimed to be saints. When I returned to Constantinople, I was no longer the girl of the hippodrome. I was something sharper, more dangerous. My past was whispered still, but now it was joined by stories of my repentance, my supposed transformation. I walked with dignity, modest robes covering what had once been displayed openly. I let the city mock my new piety, even as I knew it intrigued them. A courtesan turned saint. That was a spectacle greater than any theatre could offer. And in Byzantium, spectacle was power. It was then that I caught his eye Justinian, the ambitious nephew of Emperor Justin. He was not yet the ruler of the empire, but already he was climbing his own ladder, one built of law, cunning, and ruthless calculation. He saw in me not just beauty, but fire, wit, and the past that could both scandalize and enthrall the city. Others warned him against me. They whispered of geese, of taverns, of shame, but Justinian was no fool. He knew that scandal could be turned into strength, that the very rumors meant to destroy me could bind me to him more tightly than any vow. When he chose me as his consort, the city gasped. Senators clutched their togas in outrage, priests muttered of sin. Noble matrons spat my name as though it were filth. But the people, the mob that filled the hippodrome, the laborers who toiled in the heat, the women who lived on scraps, they cheered. For in me they saw a reflection of themselves. I was not born into wealth or titles. I had clawed my way from dirt and shame to the palace gates. And when I walked through them at Justinian's side, crowned in jewels that once seemed unreachable, they cheered as though they themselves had been crowned. This was the path to power. Vice turned to virtue, scandal turned to spectacle, shame turned to sovereignty. I had taken the worst that Byzantium could throw at a woman: hunger, humiliation, lust, betrayal, and I had turned it into a throne. The same men who once laughed at me now bowed. The same priests who once condemned me now begged for my favor. The same empire that had tried to bury me now raised me up as its empress. But do not mistake this for a fairy tale. Power in Byzantium is never pure. It is bought with secrets, secured with blood, defended with lies. I had risen, yes. But to keep my place, I would need to wield every weapon the empire had taught me. My body, my wit, my faith, my cruelty, all of them. For Byzantium did not forgive. It did not forget. And it would test me until the day I died. So judge me if you must. Call me harlot, sinner, witch. But also call me what I became, empress. I was Theodora, wife of Justinian, co-ruler of the Byzantine Empire. And my path to power was paved with horrors that made me dangerous, because I had survived them all. Power in Byzantium was not held only in the throne room, beneath mosaics and golden domes. It was held in whispers in corridors, in the silence of chambers, in the darkness of the bed. I learned quickly that to rule an empire, one must first rule a household, and the palace was no ordinary household. It was a city of secrets, and its true walls were not marble but flesh. When I entered the palace as Justinian's consort, I knew I was not welcomed. The nobles saw me as a stain, the senators as a scandal, the priests as a threat. But Justinian did not care for their opinions. He saw only my usefulness. Together, we crafted an image, he, the stern and disciplined ruler, I, the repentant courtesan transformed into empress. But behind the public mask, we both knew that the court was a battlefield, and the first war was always fought in the bedchamber. The Byzantine palace was filled with women wives, widows, daughters, concubines, slaves, each with their own ambitions, each with their own dangers. Eunuchs patrolled the corridors, loyal to whoever paid them best, carrying messages, arranging meetings, spreading rumors. Senators' wives visited me with honeyed smiles, offering gifts, but behind their eyes I saw the same contempt they voiced at home. They came not for friendship, but for information. To learn my weaknesses, I gave them none. I discovered that intimacy in Byzantium was never private. Every touch, every glance, every rumor of the emperor's affections was weighed like coin. If a slave whispered that Justinian had favored me one night, it spread by morning to the Senate, to the streets, to the taverns. Our marriage bed was not ours alone. It was a stage upon which the empire's politics were played, and so I learned to wield it as such. Justinian was not a man of lust like others. His appetites were for power and law, but he listened to me in ways he listened to no one else. In our chamber, with the doors closed, I bent his ear. I reminded him of enemies, I suggested allies, I whispered strategies, while his head rested on the same pillow as mine. Men who thought themselves mighty would kneel before him, never realizing that their fates had been decided not in the Senate, but in the quiet of our bed. That was Byzantium's horrifying truth. The palace was not ruled by marble thrones, but by silken sheets. Mistresses could topple generals, slaves could whisper emperors into rage. Eunuchs who passed between chambers held more power than senators who debated 4 hours. And I, who had once been mocked for my shamelessness, understood better than any how to wield intimacy as a weapon. But it was not only in my chamber. The entire palace breathed with vice. I saw noblemen take slave girls without hesitation, priests who thundered of purity sneaking into darkened rooms, widows who offered themselves for influence. Marriage was nothing more than politics written on the body. Daughters were traded for alliances, sisters were sacrificed for treaties, wives endured husbands not for love, but for survival. And those who could not endure often found poison hidden in their cups. The eunuchs fascinated me most. Castrated as boys, they were forbidden the pleasures of flesh, yet they moved through the palace with power that rivaled generals. They were confidants of emperors, guardians of chambers, keepers of secrets. Their loyalty was not to God, nor to family, but to survival. And survival made them dangerous. Many feared them, but I learned to use them. I gave them gifts, trust, and above all, respect. In return, they carried my words where my presence could not reach. They were my spies, my messengers, my shadows. Through them, I extended my reach into every corner of the palace. What horrified me most was not the acts themselves, but how normal they were. To the outside world, Constantinople was the new Rome, the city of God's empire. To those within the palace walls, it was a hive of appetites. Senators bribed slaves for rumors, wives seduced guards for favors. Generals offered daughters to secure positions. Even priests bartered confessions for political gain. The palace was a sanctum of hypocrisy, where holiness and corruption slept in the same bed. And I, Theodora, thrived in it. I who had been raised in the theatre knew how to play a part. I let the nobles believe I had abandoned my past, while never forgetting the lessons it taught me. I let the priests see me as repentant, while knowing they feared the sins I could expose. I let Justinian believe he was the sole master, while ensuring he never forgot the counsel whispered by his empress. Was I cruel? Yes. Was I dangerous? More than any sword. For my power was not the strength of soldiers nor the weight of law. It was the ability to bend desire, to shape rumor, to control the secrets that pulsed through the palace. And those who underestimated me quickly learned that a woman who once survived the hippodrome's jeers could survive anything. In the throne room, I sat beside Justinian as equal. But in truth, it was in the palace's hidden chambers where my empire was built. There, in the silken darkness, I ruled, not with armies, but with whispers. not with decrees, but with intimacy, not with mercy, but with memory. For I never forgot the men who once spat at me, the matrons who once mocked me, the priests who once condemned me. In the palace, I had the power to repay each insult, and I did, slowly, carefully, until none dared speak my name with contempt. They called me dangerous. They were right. I was dangerous because I had learned that the most horrifying weapon of Byzantium was not steel or gold. It was flesh, and flesh, wielded well, could rule an empire. Of all the masks Byzantium wore, none was heavier than the mask of holiness. We called ourselves the Empire of God, heirs to Constantine, guardians of the true faith. But within the palace, behind the gilded icons and glittering mosaics, holiness was little more than a costume. The same men who knelt before relics at dawn whispered filth into the ears of slaves by night. The same priests who thundered sermons of purity came crawling into chambers where coin bought silence. I saw it all, and I understood. Religion in Byzantium was not a path to heaven. It was a weapon. I had grown up despised by priests. They spat at me when I walked near Hagia Sophia as a girl, muttering that my very presence was pollution. They condemned me from their pulpits, making me the face of vice when they wanted to terrify their flocks into obedience. But when I became empress, those same priests bowed until their foreheads touched the ground. Their lips that once cursed my name begged for my favor, for patronage, for gold to adorn their churches. Holiness could be bought, and I bought it, but I was not content with simply buying silence. I learned to turn the church itself into a tool. I had seen how easily the people could be swayed by ritual, the incense rising like smoke, the chants echoing like thunder, the icons glittering like stars. Byzantium's people craved piety, even if its rulers did not, and so I clothed myself in it. I fasted publicly, I prayed before the crowds, I gave to convents and monasteries. I let them see me kneeling, weeping, confessing. And when they looked upon me, they whispered not whore, but holy. Do not think this meant I believed. Faith was a cloak I wore, and like all cloaks, it could be cast off when I chose. But I did admire one truth of religion, its power over men's minds. A senator could resist bribes, a general could resist seduction, but who could resist the voice of God, even when spoken by the lips of a sinner? I made sure those lips were mine. The hypocrisy of the church was my shield. They condemned adultery, yet ignored the liaisons of emperors. They condemned obscenity, yet described my supposed sins in more detail than any actor could perform. They thundered against lust, yet lusted themselves in silence. I saw through them, and I used their hypocrisy to protect myself. If they whispered of my past, I reminded them of their own. If they sought to shame me, I gave them gold and silenced them with their greed. And in time, I went further. I turned religion into a sword. When enemies rose against me, I painted them as enemies of God. I whispered to bishops that this senator mocked the faith, that this general consorted with heretics. I let the church thunder against them in sermons, while my hands remained clean. The people, ever hungry for piety, turned their anger not against me, but against those I marked. Hypocrisy was not only survival, it was power. But perhaps the most horrifying truth was how much the people needed the illusion. They knew the palace was corrupt, yet they begged for the theatre of holiness. They wanted to believe their empress prayed for them, that their emperor was God's chosen. So I gave them what they wanted. I draped myself in jewels that glittered like stars around holy icons. I knelt in Hagia Sophia, while mosaics glowed with divine light. And the people cheered. They did not care whether my tears were real. They cared only that they saw them. Even Justinian, so obsessed with law, used piety as a hammer. His codes thundered against immorality, but he wrote them while lying beside a woman whose past was filled with every rumor of vice. He built Hagia Sophia, the grandest church in Christendom, while our palace echoed with whispers of cruelty and lust. He too wore the mask, and together we performed our roles, emperor and empress, sons of the empire, holy rulers of a holy people. But in private, I laughed. I laughed at the priests who thought themselves untouchable while I held their secrets. I laughed at the senators who clutched their crosses while begging for my favor. I laughed at the people who cheered my piety, never realizing that their holy empress was the same girl who once writhed on the stage of the hippodrome. The mask was complete, and no one dared tear it away. Yet sometimes, alone in my chamber, I wondered if the mask had become my face. Had I convinced even myself? When I prayed, was it performance? Or was it a cry from the girl who once slept hungry in the shadows of Constantinople? When I gave gold to a convent, was it strategy? Or was it a shred of guilt for the sins I had both committed and invented by my enemies? I do not know, perhaps both, but this I know: religion in Byzantium was never about God. It was about power. And I, Theodora, wielded it as ruthlessly as any sword. The most horrifying practice was not the theatre, not the taverns, not even the palace. It was the altar itself, drenched in hypocrisy, used to crown monsters as saints. And if I was crowned the most dangerous empress in history, it was because I knew the truth no priest would speak, that in Byzantium, holiness was the greatest lie of all. Every empire thrives on scandal, and Byzantium thrived more than most. In Rome, men feared swords. In Constantinople, they feared whispers. No throne, no generalship, no holy office was secure against the poison of rumor. I knew this because I had lived it from childhood. My enemies sharpened my name into a blade and cut me with it every chance they had. They called me harlot, beast, witch. They painted me with filth, then marveled when I rose above it. But they never learned the lesson I already knew. Scandal is not always a chain. Sometimes it is a crown. The palace was a hive of secrets, and I sat at its center. Slaves carried trays of food, but also carried whispers. Eunuchs managed chambers, but also managed schemes. Courtiers who smiled at me by day mocked me by night, certain their words would never reach my ears. They were wrong. My spies were everywhere. I knew who shared whose bed, who stole from whose purse, who plotted betrayal over wine. And with every secret I gathered, I held another leash. They accused me of keeping the palace as a brothel, filling it with debauchery, making senators and priests crawl like dogs for my amusement. They whispered of orgies, held in hidden rooms, of slaves forced to perform vile acts for my laughter, of generals humiliated by games too shameful to speak aloud. Was it true? Some of it, not all. But I let the rumors grow because they made me feared. And fear is the sharpest weapon an empress can wield. Understand this: the Byzantine palace was not a sanctuary of saints. It was a labyrinth of appetites. Every emperor before and after Justinian filled its chambers with lust disguised as privilege. Courtiers competed for power with their daughters' hands. Generals bribed eunuchs with slave girls. Priests whispered absolution in exchange for flesh. I did not invent these horrors. I inherited them. The difference was that I did not pretend to be blind. Yes, I kept slaves. Thousands of them filled my palace. Cooks, seamstresses, dancers, guards, scribes. Some were treated kindly, others cruelly. Some I trusted with my life. Others I punished without hesitation. It was the way of empire. Slaves built it. Slaves sustained it. But my enemies twisted this into accusations. They said I took slaves to my bed, men and women alike, that I used them not as servants, but as playthings. Perhaps I did. Why should I deny it? In a world where men used women like coin, why should a woman not do the same when she held the crown? Still, I understood the power of spectacle. I let certain whispers live while crushing others. If they called me shameless, so be it shamelessness meant untouchable. If they called me cruel, so be it cruelty meant feared. Better a dangerous empress than a weak one. Better to be accused of ruling a palace of vice than to be seen as a puppet of senators and priests. The most horrifying truth was not whether I kept such scandals alive, but how eagerly the city devoured them. The same people who prayed in Hagia Sophia by day thronged the taverns by night to hear the latest filth about their empress. They believed the most obscene tales not because they were true, but because they wanted them to be true. Scandal was entertainment, and I was their theatre. And if they were watching me, they were not watching Justinian's failings. In that sense, my scandal was his shield, but secrets were my true strength. I knew of priests who bought slave boys in the market, of generals who dressed their mistresses as holy virgins, of senators who poisoned their wives to marry younger ones. These were the men who called me corrupt, yet I could expose them with a word. I rarely needed to. The threat alone was enough. More than once, a rival who dared to slander me fell suddenly silent after I reminded him how fragile his reputation was. That was Byzantium's hypocrisy. All were guilty, but only the powerful could afford their guilt. What horrified me most in those years was how thin the line between power and degradation truly was. One night a senator mocked me in his villa. The next he crawled to me in secret, begging for favor. One day a priest condemned me from his pulpit. The next I received word that he had been caught in bed with his own slave. They wore masks of virtue, but I had seen their true faces. And I wore my vice openly, daring them to match me. Did I humiliate men? Yes, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, sometimes with acts that made them tremble. Did I take pleasure in it? Perhaps, but more than pleasure, it was protection. In a palace where women were pawns, I made myself queen. I used the weapons they feared most: scandal, shame, and the threat of exposure. In doing so, I ruled not only with Justinian, but beside him, and sometimes above him. Let history say what it will. Let them tell their tales of orgies and slaves, of perversions whispered behind palace doors. Some will be true, some lies, but the greater truth is this: scandal is Byzantium's lifeblood. Without it, the empire would have withered. With it, I thrived. And if I was feared as the most dangerous empress in history, it was not because of what I did in secret, but because I turned secrets themselves into my empire. Byzantium was built on marble and mosaics, but it was held together by betrayal. Every throne in Constantinople was soaked in blood of rivals, of friends, of family. And if I am to confess the truth of my reign, it is this: I survived not because I was pure, but because I betrayed more ruthlessly than those who sought to betray me. When I became empress, the Senate whispered that I was unworthy, that a woman of my past had no right to sit beside Justinian. The generals muttered that I was dangerous, that my influence would poison the empire. The priests hissed that I was a whore wrapped in silk. But none dared move openly against me, not at first. They waited, plotting, certain that scandal or chance would undo me. They underestimated my will. The first great test came with fire and fury. The Nika riots. The city burned with rage, factions of the Hippodrome turning against Justinian, demanding his abdication. The streets filled with blood as rebels proclaimed a new emperor. Senators urged Justinian to flee. Even he wavered, but I did not. I told him that purple makes a fine burial shroud. I told him I would rather die an empress than live in flight. My words cut through his fear, and together we unleashed vengeance. The generals marched into the Hippodrome with swords drawn, slaughtering tens of thousands. The rebels' screams echoed 4 days. And when the smoke cleared, the people knew I, Theodora, was no puppet. I was iron. But rebellion was not the only danger. Rivals within the palace schemed constantly. Senators who smiled at me in public conspired with generals in private. Priests prayed loudly in the church while whispering treason in darkened halls. And so, I wielded my weapons, secrets and scandal. Those who plotted against me found their own sins dragged into light. A senator who accused me of immorality was soon exposed for poisoning his wife. A priest who thundered against my past was revealed to have bought slave boys in secret. One by one, they were silenced not by swords, but by whispers I loosed like daggers. Still, Whispers were not always enough. Some enemies had to be destroyed in blood. I remember the wives of noble men who mocked me in my youth. When they sought influence at court, I denied them. When they dared oppose me, I crushed them, stripping their families of wealth and sending them into exile. Some never returned. Some never lived too. They thought me merciless, and they were right. Mercy was a luxury I could not afford. Even within my own family, betrayal was necessary. My sisters, once my companions in shame, became rivals when they sought favor. I gave them wealth, titles, protection, but always at a distance. I trusted no one fully, not even those bound by blood. For I had learned long ago that blood is the first currency spent in Byzantium. The eunuchs, too, tested my loyalty. They carried secrets from chamber to chamber, believing themselves untouchable. But those who betrayed me discovered that even they could bleed. Some disappeared quietly, their bodies never found. Others were paraded through the streets as examples of treachery. The people whispered in fear, but they also whispered respect. Better to be feared than forgotten. Was I cruel? Yes, but cruelty was survival. The palace was a nest of vipers, and I was the viper queen. Every smile concealed a dagger, every prayer a plot. To survive, I struck first. And if blood stained my hands, it was no darker than the blood that already drenched the throne I sat upon. The most horrifying practice of Byzantium was not the orgies of the theatre, nor the hypocrisy of the church, nor the corruption of the palace. It was betrayal, the endless cycle of lies and treachery that consumed us all. Husbands betrayed wives, wives betrayed husbands, fathers betrayed sons, sons betrayed mothers. Trust was a myth, loyalty was a performance. Love was a mask, only power was real. And I, Theodora, mastered betrayal. I turned it into art. I betrayed those who underestimated me, those who sought to use me, those who dared to mock me. And when history remembers me as dangerous, it is because I learned the lesson Byzantium teaches all who survive: betray or be betrayed. Do I regret the blood? Sometimes, in quiet moments. I recall the faces of those who fell rebels in the hippodrome, rivals in the Senate, servants who chose the wrong master. Their cries echo in my memory, but regret is weakness, and weakness is death. Better to be feared than pitied, better to be called cruel than to be forgotten. So let them say Theodora was merciless, that she ruled with scandal and blood. Let them call me dangerous, they are right. For I ruled not by love or trust, but by betrayal. And in Byzantium, betrayal was the truest form of loyalty, loyalty to survival. History does not remember women kindly. Men may murder thousands, enslave nations, burn cities, and they are called conquerors. Women who survive shame, wield power, bend men to their will, we are called monsters. And so, as I near the end of my life, I know what they will call me. They will call me harlot, witch, Jezebel, Horrempress. They will write my name in venom, coating their words in holy rhetoric. They will make my scandals larger than my victories, my sins greater than my strength, and perhaps they are not wrong. For I was dangerous. I was everything they feared. When I was a child, I slept on straw in a shack. When I became a woman, I slept in taverns where lust bought survival. When I became empress, I slept beneath domes of gold, while bishops bowed to me. The girl in rags became the woman in silk, but the fire within her never changed. That fire, born of hunger, humiliation, and rage, carried me to the throne of the greatest empire on earth. I confess this. I was never innocent. I used my body as a weapon when I had nothing else. I used scandal as a shield when no one would defend me. I used secrets as daggers when blades were denied me. I betrayed, I humiliated, I destroyed, and I ruled. That is my legacy, not purity, not piety, but survival turned into sovereignty. What horrified my enemies most was not that I had once been shameless. It was that I remained shameless even as empress. I did not beg forgiveness for my past. I did not bow to their contempt. I looked them in the eye and dared them to defy me. I sat beside Justinian, not as ornament, but as equal. When the city burned, I held my ground while men trembled. When rebels rose, I chose slaughter over surrender. When rivals whispered, I silenced them with their own sins. I was a woman who refused to kneel, and for that, they hated me. But hatred is also a kind of power. It kept me alive. It made me feared. And fear, more than love, built my empire. I know they will repeat the stories. The geese in the theatre, the obscene acts in the hippodrome, the orgies whispered in the palace. They will cling to those tales, because they are easier to tell than the truth. The truth is more horrifying, that a woman, despised and shamed, rose higher than generals, priests, and senators, and ruled them all. That is what terrifies them, not what I did with my body, but what I did with my will. Some will call me saint. After my death, perhaps, some church will lift my name as patron of repentance, of transformation. They will paint my face in mosaics, cloak me in light, pretend I was a symbol of piety. Let them, saints are as useful as sinners, and I was both. But I know what I was most of all, dangerous. Dangerous because I learned every secret of Byzantium's soul. Dangerous because I understood that holiness was a mask, that scandal was a weapon, that betrayal was survival. Dangerous because I dared to use what men feared most, a woman who could not be silenced. In the end, I leave behind contradictions. I was empress of a Christian empire, yet born in sin. I was wife to the most powerful man of my age, yet more feared than he. I was remembered for scandal, yet built churches and convents. I was mocked as shameless, yet raised to the highest dignity a woman could hold. Was I sinner or saint, harlot or holy mother? The answer is all of them and none. I was Theodora. If there is one lesson my life teaches, it is this: power is never given, it is taken. Taken by those willing to endure hunger, humiliation, and hatred without breaking. Taken by those who wear shame as armor, scandal as a crown, betrayal as a sword. Taken by those willing to be called monsters, so that they may survive as rulers. And if history remembers me as the most dangerous empress Byzantium ever produced, then let it be so. Dangerous women are the only ones worth remembering. She was called a harlot, a saint, a witch, an empress. She was Theodora, born in shame, rising in fire, and remembered as the most dangerous woman Byzantium ever produced. Her story is not only one of scandal and sin, but of survival, ambition, and the horrifying truth that in Byzantium, power was never holy. It was always flesh, always betrayal, always blood.